I think it's important that government doesn't dither as it did back in 2020 and do nothing. And this is a case for targeted measures, very light touch measures. Some million Chinese came to the UK pre-COVID in 2019, and they're an important backbone of our economy from a travel point of view. But I think nobody wants to see COVID testing and travel testing re-emerge, not least the Prime Minister, who has been firmly against it for some time, because he knows the damage that these measures do to our economy and to hundreds of thousands of jobs that were lost during the pandemic. So I don't want to see, and none of us in the travel sector want to see a return to those bad old days. However, I think it's important that government doesn't dither as it did back in 2020 and do nothing. And this is a case for targeted measures, very light touch measures, which would involve taking the 6 flights a day that come into the UK from China and Hong Kong and not doing any testing here in the UK, but just asking airlines to check for negative COVID test proof before those passengers depart China for the UK. And that would be the most obvious thing to do now, just to monitor the situation and see what's going on before any real data comes out.
Is that the case, that it's only 6 flights a day that come in from China and Hong Kong to the UK?
That's right.
That's
So
incredible.
you have British Airways, Cathay Pacific, and other airlines like China Southern and Air China flying in. And I mean, it's a sizable number when you take it over a month, 700 to 2,000 people a day. They're really important to the UK market. And of course, what's going to happen after January the 8th, when China opens up its borders, is you will see a lot more Chinese coming back to the UK to see friends and family, to go shopping, especially ahead of the Chinese New Year on January the 22nd.
But if it is only 6 flights a day, is it really that much to ask of those passengers? And is it really that much of a strain on airport capacity here in the UK to say they should have had a negative test before they get on that flight to come off their flight in the UK?
Well, airlines are prepared for this sort of eventuality, and it's not that difficult to ask passengers to upload their test proof, their negative test proof, before they're given their boarding pass before leaving China. That's the easiest thing to do. Nobody really wants to see testing re-emerge on arrival in the UK at Heathrow, Birmingham, Manchester, whichever airport they come into. That would be a retrograde step, as some countries are doing, like Italy, because then you're putting back in place the infrastructure that was so vilified, if you like, during the COVID pandemic. We don't want to go back to those bad old days. We're living with COVID. But in this particular case, the reason why a light touch targeted approach would work and make sense for the government to be seen to be doing something is because simply that we know that the data is not of sufficient quality to be able to make an informed decision. So until China produces that quality data, this light touch would be the best way forward.
And it's that concern about transparency which makes China such a special case in this regard, isn't it? I imagine you can't see this concern or this talk of a return to travel restrictions actually really applying for many other countries, really.
No, there's no reason at all it should apply. There's no threats from variants from other countries at this stage. And to be fair, there's no obvious threat from China at the moment, but we're only going on the information that's being shared. And so one way for the UK government to get their own information is, of course, to ask passengers to show their negative proof before they even get on a plane in China. That would start to sort out who are the travellers without any issues at all. And I think it would be a sensible compromise for the Prime Minister to go down that route to appease some of his own backbenchers, of course, who are calling for much tougher measures. But nobody wants tougher measures, even though there's a gap in the quality of information coming through from China.
Just finally, Paul, a word about what's happening in our airports at the moment because of the border force strikes, which continue today and they're going to continue on Saturday as well. The Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, was behind a desk himself yesterday, seeming to suggest that things are moving completely smoothly. You wouldn't necessarily know there was a strike, such were the contingency measures that they'd put in place. Do you think that is the case? And what do you make of the concern that actually it's been so smooth because some people are getting through who maybe shouldn't?
It's impressively smooth, actually, and perhaps it's a surprise that it's so smooth. But if you look at other countries like France and Spain, they use their military and their army very effectively at airports to check passengers and security channels. And clearly, there's a very efficient process going on here with our military as well, who seem to have done a really good job. So if I was in the Border Force Union, the PCS, I'd be worried that my strikes are not having the impact that they wanted in terms of causing the delays and queues and frustrations for those coming into the UK. There are going to be more strikes after this round finishes tomorrow, but of course they're not going to seemingly have the impact as long as the government holds out.
But it
So
might.
Ben Wallace so far seems to have done a good job.
But it may be smooth, but again, is there not a concern that people might be getting through who shouldn't? Are we going to be reading in the newspapers in a few weeks' time, stories of, insert name of random unsavoury person who's managed to slip through the border because of the disruption?
It's a really good question, and I know the union has accused accused the military of causing this situation where some might be getting through, but we just don't know, of course. All we know is it seems to be a seamless process at the moment. Don't forget, there are still very senior Border Force officials in place who are checking, and they do a lot of pre-checking. You don't just hand over your passport when you arrive at the airport. Many security officials at the airlines are checking you before you even get on the plane to come to the UK. So there's a lot of pre-checking that's done to assess any threats coming into the UK. It's not all done as soon as you hand over your passport.